Hello. For the record, I'm Dr. Kent Chamberlin, and I'm speaking to you today on behalf of the community. In my presentation, I hope to provide you with insights about the effects of cell towers and how they relate to your zoning policies and practices. Cell towers are becoming a significant zoning issue across the country, and many municipalities are struggling with this challenge. This is especially difficult when cell towers need special zoning variances, special use permits, or are proposed in sensitive areas such as near schools, hospitals, and homes. As you'll see in my presentation, cell towers have significant impacts that create zoning issues. We, as municipalities, business owners, and residents, should have the right to decide what happens in our communities, including what we will or won't allow and why. Let's look at the findings of the New Hampshire Commission, which investigated wireless radiation, including radiation from cell towers. This is highly relevant to the discussion you're having today. Due to time constraints, I can provide only a very brief overview of the Commission's findings, but it should give you a reasonable understanding of the realities behind wireless radiation as evaluated by independent experts. An important starting point in describing the New Hampshire Commission is to let you know why it was formed. Basically, legislators were being told by their constituents that they were being harmed by wireless radiation, by cell towers, and industry was saying, nah, there's no harm associated with wireless radiation. So the legislators decided that they needed to form a commission to find out the truth once and for all about wireless radiation. And basically, this is formal legislation. It had to go through both houses of the legislature and be signed by the governor. And in the final analysis, the commission ended up with 13 members, and including people with backgrounds in medicine, as you can see on the slide, physics, toxicology, electromagnetics, that was my contribution, epidemiology, biostatistics. In other words, people with the backgrounds to answer the questions that were being posed in the legislation. And we ended up meeting for over a year, and we looked at things such as peer-reviewed and commission-vetted publications. But because we acknowledge that not everything that's in a peer-reviewed publication is true, we had our own vetting process within the commission. So that was one and probably the most important source of information for us in the commission. We also invited people from the regulatory agencies. Federal Communications Commission, Food and Drug Administration, Environmental Protection Agency. Even though we invited them, they didn't show up. Well, the fact that the people wouldn't come from government agencies when asked to do so by a formal state commission tells a lot, and I'll say more about that later. We also brought in outside experts, and all of them provided clear evidence about the harms of wireless radiation, all of them except one. And that one who did not acknowledge those harms of wireless radiation was the one expert brought in by the telecommunications industry. It was the only one paid to attend. Everybody else attended and presented to us on a volunteer basis. So this is a quick overview, as I mentioned earlier, but I do want to note that the outcome of the peer-reviewed literature is that we identified hundreds of top-tier, and I want to stress top-tier publications that showed harm from low-level wireless radiation exposure, because the vast majority of those peer-reviewed publications did show harm from exposure. And I have a link there that does an analysis of how many showed harm and how many didn't show harm. Over 90% of the studies that looked into oxidative stress, free radical damage from exposure to wireless radiation, over 90% did show an effect. Now, this is important because oxidative stress, free radicals, lead to chronic inflammation and lead to a host of diseases. But in all of these cases, like sperm damage, we know that the sperm rate or the sperm count for younger men is on the decline and has been for a while now. Neurodegenerative disease also very much. Parkinson's also on the increase. Alzheimer's deaths has more than doubled since the year 2000. We know what's going on with cancer. It's on the increase. Diabetes, the same thing. So I'm not saying that wireless radiation necessarily causes that increase, but it's certainly an effect that needs to be taken into account because there has been, as we all know, an increase in our exposure to wireless radiation since roughly 2000, and that's where we're seeing an increase in some of these diseases. And let's go and look at on the ground what it looks like. And so here's an example, just one example of where in California, this is actually quite a while back, about 2004, when somebody thought it would be a good idea to put cell towers on or near fire stations. What happened when they turned them on? Well, within a week of installation, many firefighters developed unusual symptoms of headache, fatigue, insomnia, memory loss, confusion, nausea, and weakness. And after a time, firefighters in stations with adjacent cell towers were found to have forgotten CPR or became lost responding to a fire in a city they grew up in. And by the way, the maximum exposure that these firefighters received was only 5% of the FCC limit. In the final analysis, the firefighters, through their unions, were able to get ordinances in place so they no longer have to have or will have cell towers on or near fire stations. Just a continued example, this is a study that comes to us from Brazil, and it took place between 1996 and 2006. And it looked at, well, the death rate for people living near towers compared to the death rate of people living far away from towers. The results of the study are shown in one slide, a single slide, where the red trace is for people living within a kilometer of a cell tower, and the blue trace is the cancer rate for the population in general. The x-axis is the distance that people live from a cell tower. And as you can see, the closer you live to a cell tower, the more likely you are to die from cancer. And that's really what the study tells us. It's important, of course, to see that the two traces converge as you get farther and farther from the cell tower. Your death rate or the likelihood of death by cancer converges to that of the population in general. Multiple studies that are showing the same thing. For example, this one right here, it's what's called a meta study. And as you can see, there's a great deal of confidence that living near a cell tower causes bad things to happen. What is important to take away from this slide is the last bullet, and that says a distance from 500 meters from a cell tower appears to be a reasonable cutoff distance. So when we in the commission got to this point, of course, we're saying, well, clearly there's a problem with, the standards that are in place right now. How were they set? So this is maybe the most important slide I have to offer because it tells you where the guidelines were set and how inappropriate they are for application today. The current limits were set in the 1980s, and they were based on short-term, I'm stressing that, short-term, an hour or less behavioral studies on 8 rats and 5 monkeys. This is somewhat shocking because these are the standards that we live with 24/7, whereas the studies to come up with the values for that exposure were done in an hour or less. And they were based only on heating effects. And because what they were saying is that if it doesn't warm you enough to harm you, then it's not going to be a problem at all. And I'll show you in an upcoming slide why that isn't true. The animals had been trained to push a lever to get food, and they were food deprived going into the study, and they were put in a cage where they were exposed to increasing levels of radiation. And eventually, they got to a point where they no longer could function because they were so heated up, that they couldn't even perform that very simple task. And the point at which they reached that point was referred to as the threshold dose of radiation. I should note that some of the monkeys had burns on their faces from that very high level of exposure, but that's what they designated as being the upper or the threshold dose. The FCC then arbitrarily divided that number, that threshold dose, by 50. They didn't have any relative risk target that they were shooting for. They just said, well, if that's the maximum they can take, well, let's divide it by 50 and call that the level that people can be exposed to 24/7, 365. Wireless radiation isn't a death ray, it's something that acts on you over time. So that begs the question, well, so how much of a signal do you actually need? If you want a strong signal, 4 to 5 bars on your phone, you need zero point zero zero 0.008 to 6 microwatts per meter squared. If you can get by with a good signal, 3 to 4 bars, well, you need values of signal level that wouldn't even bother anybody. And I should note that with my iPhone SE, I can download videos from YouTube with only 2 bars. Why isn't the FCC protecting us? And that can be shown in one slide right here. It's from the Harvard University Center for Ethics. And what it shows is that the industry controls the FCC. It's a revolving door that's shown there. Why do they need to set the levels so high? Well, it's not surprising. It's money. And that is to put in a tower in a population center and be able to turn up the power to very high levels. You get a great coverage area. You're causing great exposures to people, but you're getting a great bang for your buck in terms of coverage area. If you did it more reasonably, and I'm saying that as a radio frequency engineer, you can provide great coverage without overly exposing people. It costs more money. If you read that article from Harvard University, it talks about how the FCC and how telecom are using the same techniques, same tactics as big tobacco did years ago. Things like cigarettes do not cause cancer. There is harm associated with wireless radiation, just as there is harm associated with smoking. And security is brought up sometimes as being a reason to have more wireless, and that's absolutely untrue. And I know this because I did research for the Department of Justice. The wireless networks are far more vulnerable to hacking than wired networks. You also should know that wireless networks can be jammed. Burglars are doing now is they're going and they're using these readily available jammers, turning on the jammers before they go into somebody's home. And that person has wireless security devices. They turn on the jammers, and those security devices become useless at that point. So they go in, rob the house. When they leave, they turn the jammer off, and nobody knows what happens. So it's something that you should consider. Also, if you're looking or considering any security issues relating to wireless, could say a lot about the home values, and the bottom line is if you have a cell tower that goes up near your home, it's likely that your property values are going to decline. And I'm finding that more and more people are aware of the harms of wireless radiation, which means that they are less and less likely to buy a home near a cell tower. So, in terms of the conclusions reached by the New Hampshire Commission, you can click on the final reports, 390 pages. Bottom lines, wireless radiation, it does propose a significant threat to human health and the environment. Wireless radiation is not nearly as secure. I just mentioned that on the last slide. And importantly, this isn't a scientific issue. The science is crystal clear about the harms of wireless radiation. It is harmful. It is a political and economic issue. I hope that this overview of the New Hampshire Commission's findings is helpful and that it provides some insight into the issue of cell towers. As was probably evident in the information presented, the Commission had to take a deep dive into the subject to reach its conclusions. Hopefully, the efforts of the Commission will make it easier for you to better understand the issues involved and to develop ordinances that are protective yet not unnecessarily restrictive. To a large degree, the community that will evolve is determined by its ordinances and zoning policies. If those ordinances and policies are written by default, the outcome may not be what you have intended because of strong external forces such as the telecommunications and other industries with their own special self-interests. Because of this, you will need to be intentional in specifying what you want your community to look like moving forward. The time for intentionality starts here in these defining moments, especially as they relate to your zoning and special use permits. Dish is going to be fine if the current permit is not approved. They will find another site for their cell tower, and your guidance via clearly defined ordinances can actually help them site their towers more easily and appropriately in your community. That is because those ordinances will tell them where towers can and cannot be located. And again, it is decision by decision, no matter how small, that eventually shapes our communities. And when it comes to cell towers, I hope that the work of the New Hampshire Commission has shown you that there is a lot that goes into the question of where a cell tower belongs, far beyond just identifying a spot and finding a willing property owner. Everything we understand about cell towers needs to be brought into our policies and these decisions. I encourage you, very highly encourage you, to turn down the administrative use permit for this site because it is far too close to residents, schools, and hospitals. In the long run, denying the tower will be in your best interest and the best interest of your community.